Hello and welcome to the GW Book Club. This is where my good friend Stu and I take a look at classic Games Workshop books. We've been making our way through the original fiction for Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000, but we've decided to do a few special episodes that are more on the non-fiction side of things. So we've been taking a look at the Warhammer Armies Empire book, and this time we're looking at Codex Eldar from the second edition of 40k. Stu, do you have any particular memories of this book? It came out in 1994, written by Rick Priestley. There were obviously this was the first generation of 40k codexes. Did you have it at the time? Were you a fan of the Eldar?
I was a fan of the Eldar. I didn't have this book. No.
Right.
So I played Eldar mostly end of Rogue Trader, beginning of the edition, but prior
Right.
to this. So the contents, the stuff that's in it, I remember very, very well. So the makeup of the army list, most of it, there's some things that are different, but the old
Hmm.
school style of Eldar with your old dreadnoughts and your D cannons, which I think was my first experience of something in a game feeling broken. It was my first
Right.
experience in life of something on the battle table going, hang on a minute, these seem a bit too good. So yeah, I played Eldar. I had a very, very old all metal Eldar army. So say all metal. I had some of the ones with the plastic arms,
Right.
but I didn't play with this edition. I just played with the kind of the get you by editions, all the previous Rogue Trader sets of the army list. And no, I didn't play
Right.
it.
Yeah. Sure. Classic. I mean,
So it's
that's
really
classic
familiar
Eldar.
to me, but also not from owning the book and
Sure.
playing it.
I don't know whether it's just of that era, but all of the Codex books and Warhammer Armies books from around that period do feel really
Mm.
familiar. I guess it's just because they've been around for like my entire time in the hobby, more or less. But like this, so I didn't have an Eldar army during second edition, but I'm almost certain. I couldn't say for sure, but I'm almost certain that I've owned this codex at some point for some reason, and I don't know why. Maybe it was just some previous bit of nostalgia 10 years ago or something, and I bought it then or whatever. But yeah, I'm familiar with the book in the same way. So it's always felt like it's around. All of the art feels super familiar. All
Yeah.
the different units, everything that's in there feels really like, okay, this is classic Eldar to me. But yeah, I didn't have an Eldar army, so I'm not entirely sure why it's so familiar. Maybe it's just because Eldar are, they're this ever-present part of 40k, really.
I think that's what it is. I think my original kind of exposure to Eldar would have been Jervis and Andy Chambers' battle reports, and it would have been the Studio Blood Angels and the Studio Alatok. I think it would have been
Yeah.
Army at the time. And it felt like they were always in those White Dwarfs around the
Mm,
time I started reading them. So 138 was my first, so around that kind of mid 150 up to
sure.
200, something, that kind of era. And this has kind of got, it's the continuation of that, really, isn't it? It's a
Yeah.
lot of those miniatures are just the same miniatures that I owned. Some of them are updated slightly. There were some new things added for this release,
Mm,
but yeah, that's probably why so much of it's so familiar. It's
yeah.
just you see more studio colors, more expressions of those, rather than just the artwork that's in Rogue Trader and some of those chapter approved army list type things that I would have worked from. So yeah, it feels very familiar, but because I played this edition of 40k a lot,
Sure.
but yeah, but not with this codex. In fact, I don't know if we're recording this a week after we recorded the Empire book. And for us, it's very fresh. By the time people are watching this, is probably a month or so ago, maybe even longer. Who knows when this is going to go out? But for us, we've just experienced that. So for me, they're quite linked at the moment with
Mm,
the first ever army book for Warhammer Fantasy, and this one of the early codexes. And I'm thinking back to my own gaming. I don't think at that stage I used codexes for gaming. I kind
right.
of got out of gaming just as the codex, the army book, became the standard thing. So I got to experience them more as I came back into gaming later on. So I was still very much a book of army lists kind of guy.
Sure.
So it's lovely going back and looking at them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, because have always loved the individual army book and the codex. This generation of codex is, for me, easily the best because this is the
Mm.
generation of Codex book that is similar to the Warhammer Armies book. And there are, it does continue for a bit, but they just get thinner. They get less focused on the world building, less focused on the lore. They become
Hmm.
more, I don't know, to my mind, later Codex editions become sort of these vibe based. Here's a very a loose sort of sense of the army, and then your crunchy mechanical rules. A lot of the fluff kind of it became increasingly light, I suppose, for
Hmm.
some armies over certain editions, and there's still great Codex books for later editions out there. I'm not saying there's not, but this generation just is again packed full of stuff because this is doing so much of the heavy lifting, I think, and we'll get into
Hmm.
it when we sort of explore the background and how things are laid out. But this is actually building the world. This is all where 40k has, with second edition 40k, truly becomes the 40k we recognize, the Rogue Trader era, which loads of amazing ideas, but kind of jumbled up almost. They're
Yes.
crystallized into something far more cohesive and structured, and like that makes a lot more sense with all of the different parts of the 40k universe together with these
Yes.
books. So, yeah, incredible stuff, I think, and it is nice to go back and check it out. But I guess one of the places, maybe the perfect place to start actually, is just the cover and the
Mm.
art. That is so impactful, I think. So this is Jeff Taylor's cover for the Eldar.
It's
It's just
incredible.
it isn't it. It's just like
Yeah.
really striking. It's so colorful, so vibrant. Blues and yellows and all this sort of really popping color. It doesn't. It's not grimdark, I guess. I would say.
No, no, it's not at all. But it's I forgot how incredible
Mm,
it really was. Yeah, it's. I was thinking about this today actually while I was cooking dinner. I was thinking about how much I really like the grimdark era,
mm,
and I also like first Rogue Trader and third edition fantasy almost had a slightly grimmer, grubbier feel to it before the red era and the bright era. And then I really enjoyed the art style of the later stuff. But I was thinking, well, does that mean I don't like these? But actually, on reflection, I really love these as well. And I mentioned this in the Empire chat is that for me, Warhammer is all of these things, depending on what mood I'm in.
yeah.
Sometimes, simple as that. I don't need to pick what my favourite is because sometimes different days of the week, different things will be. And for me, it's all Warhammer or Warhammer 40k. And it is grim in some ways as well. The black and white artwork in this still got that kind of old school feel to it. It's slightly grim, and the setting is grim. But in many ways, it's not the artwork as much. It's almost the miniatures and the presentation, the photography style is quite bright at that point, and I think that's maybe where that kind of imagery comes from more than the actual artwork.
Mm,
I think it's stronger in the miniatures. The red era stuff is
yeah.
stronger in the miniatures than it is, and just because this is a big colourful front cover, well, it's colourful because they're aspect warriors
Yeah.
of Eldar on a front cover. And if you take away the Codex Eldar top plate, maybe that's what's making it look bright. So
Mm.
it's not always the art; it's what's around it and the way that art's presented, I think.
That's an interesting point, actually. Yeah, and then the grim darkness of it is kind of fascinating because you're right. There's a difference. It still works. And I share that exact same view of like I love all of it. I love the goofiness. I love the bright popping colors. I love the grim darkness. All of these different versions that you can get from Warhammer Fantasy Battles, from 40k, from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. They're all slightly different versions. Even the Gotrek and Felix novels kind of go into some higher fantasy stuff than you would see in certain
Yeah.
aspects of the tabletop games. But it is all Warhammer. It's just these different facets and different days of the week, like you say.
Mm.
But when it comes to the art in this book, I mean, there's four credited artists. So you've got John Blanche, Mark Gibbons, Wayne England, and Jez Goodwin. I think actually there's probably only one Goodwin piece that I could
Yeah.
identify in here, and the Wayne England art, I suspect, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect is actually the sort of iconography and the kind of liveries and coats of
I,
arms and
I,
stuff,
I think so. Yes, I
which
think so.
means that the vast majority of the art is by John Blanche and Mark Gibbons. They're kind of 50-50, and you
Yeah.
get these two slightly different flavors of it's all black and white and it's all amazing. Both artists firing on all cylinders, I think. But with the John Blanche stuff, you get that kind of scratchy, hyper detailed, the classic John Blanche art style,
Hmm.
really busy in an interesting way art.
Yeah.
Everything's kind of got all these sort of extra points and curves and all sorts of stuff everywhere. And then the Mark Gibbons stuff is almost this like heroic darkness of like
Yes.
every single character is kind of stood in an amazing heroic cinematic pose, looking the coolest they have ever looked. Just absolutely awesome. Well, I'd be like, what are your thoughts on those? There's sort of two art styles that run through the whole thing.
Thinking as you were describing that, I've got page 6 open, which is an Avatar, and again, it's a Mark
Yeah,
Gibbons. I was just thinking as you're describing John Blanche's work, it's much more visceral and you see the brushstrokes, you see the pen marks, that kind of thing. Whereas Mark Gibbons' stuff is also slightly more refined,
Hmm.
and then gives that different kind of energy, like he said, heroic and powerful.
Yeah,
Whereas a lot of the Blanche stuff is more mood based.
yes,
Um, and but I think they both work so well. I think they complement each other really well throughout. Um, they don't. Flicking through them now, looking at all the little drawings that are inset into the sort of the text areas, and they don't jump out as, oh, that one doesn't seem
Hmm.
in place. And partly just because they're all black and white, I suppose, so it kind of
Yeah.
brings that
There's some continuity.
feel for it. Um, but that might be away in England there. There's a Harlequin potentially,
Right.
but it just feels like Warhammer from that era for me. You're just so
Does.
familiar. It's like
Yeah.
flicking through the pages of White Dwarf. You're seeing the same
Yes.
artwork style. You're seeing the same small vignettes that in between paragraphs that you find in those books. They use their artwork a lot more. They didn't just hold it all back for the publications like they do now in some ways. You just don't see this kind of pen black and white kind of art style now
Yeah.
anymore. And I do miss it. At this era I was doing art at GCSE, and I went on to do A-level art, and I loved, my favorite way at the time was to draw in pen. So I look at this stuff now, and the amount of times I've been failing to replicate this kind of drawing, because I just loved it. I love the whole style of it.
Yeah.
So it is great, and I think they all
They
complement each
do.
other really well.
Yeah, they do, and I think you're right. I mean, there is that from the John Blanche stuff because there's a sort of perfect, intentional, almost I don't know, incompleteness to the John Blanche pieces, but because they're so busy and scratchy, they are these mood pieces. Like you're seeing just a glimpse of a universe that you don't know through like a scratched sort of mirror or something.
Mm.
It is a really you're getting a glimpse of this other realm, and that's why it gives that really good, almost scene setting vibes and mood to the whole
Yeah.
book. And then yeah, all of the very clean lines of the Mark Gibbons pieces really help you understand the specifics of, oh, right, okay, so that's what a Dire Avenger looks like. So when I buy the miniature for it, I'm going to know what I'm getting. So when you have that with all, laid out really nicely, it's very easy, sort of in the totality of the book, to understand, okay, here's the feel of the Eldar and their background and their world. And then here's the specific armies and units of the Eldar. And obviously there's an heavy metal section that does that as well. But the art does a really good job of getting you to that place where you can know what
Hmm.
your Eldar army is going to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I've flicked to page 24 now, and you've got a Mark Gibbons Warlock, which is, like you say, heroic, neater, more refined. And then, bizarrely, a Guardian that you'd think would be quite basic, but the illustration that's clearly a Blanche drawing, and he looks like he's wearing some kind of tiger stripe or leopard skin fur kind of cape with him as well. So he's a guardian, but he's also not a guardian. And I'm guessing he's
Yeah,
the leader of that particular unit. And they used to be aspect warriors, didn't they? The leaders of the squads of
yeah,
guardians. So I can see what that's the individuality there for that one. But Blanche gets that kind of slightly wackiness into the most basic troop form
yeah.
that you have. But it does, yeah. It works very well. I definitely don't scroll through this or flick through this book thinking, oh, that one seems
Yeah.
different.
Are there any favorites from across the book that you've got?
Oh, I did like that the one I was talking, the Avatar, sort
Mm.
of at the beginning of the book, that first sort of big full pager.
Yeah, it's very
I love
impactful.
the background. It's maybe the most simple part of it, but the kind of smoky, broiling um, fire that's in the background. I'm a big fan of that. That might be my favourite, but I don't know. I find it hard to choose favourites because you just think,
I
oh
mean, there's
no,
so
but now
much
this
good.
one, but
Yeah,
now
there's
this one.
so much good stuff. I mean, I think for me, I think it's on page 8. There is a John Blanche craft world image. You can just get
Uh-huh.
this sense of this enormous kind of bulbous craft, and then you can see it's so small, sadly, and I'm sure it, or I hope it was a bigger piece in real life. But like you could just see the detail of the Eldar ships alongside it, the fleets
Yeah.
together. I don't know. There's something about it that just kind of has this kind of yeah, it's a very appealing image to me. It sets the tone of this sort of drifting in space, this race of like the fire. It's almost Battlestar Galactica kind of background of just they're
Yes.
all that's left, and you kind of see that in that image in a very very cool way. And also, and that might be my favorite. My second favorite might be another John Blanche one, which is the Exodite Knight, which
Yes.
is awesome, just because it's an Eldar riding a dragon.
Yes. Yes.
Which is very cool.
It is cool. Yeah, I think there's a drawing on page 7 of the book as well, where it talks about the Eldar path under the Guardians, and it actually looks like a dire adventure. But it's again just a that's a Blanche one, I think. Oh no, it might be a Jez Goodwin. Actually, it's hard to tell, isn't it?
That's a
Sometimes
good one. Yeah,
that's a
that's a
good
good
one.
one.
Yeah, and I love it. I suppose
Yeah,
maybe much of his artwork was just around designing the miniature ranges,
I think so. Yeah,
they're kind of posed and set in a way that it's
yeah.
for his
He's
development
present.
rather than
Yeah, his work is present in all of the other images because
yeah.
he's
It's
yeah
his baby, isn't it?
yeah
Really, it feels that
yeah
way.
for
But
sure.
yeah, I do love that one. That's probably my favourite actually.
Yeah, it's good. It's really really good. So getting into the background, then, I mean,
Mm.
you mentioned obviously you were an Eldar player from the OG from Rogue Trader. There is
Hmm.
there's an advancement and a sort of deepening of the lore for the Eldar with
Yes.
this book. It kind of brings together stuff that had been bubbling away and developing for 6 years over the course of Rogue Trader's life. Well, longer even because we've got a couple of years of further development. But what were your thoughts about revisiting this version of the lore and this setup for the Eldar? There's, like we say, there's Battlestar Galactica. They're all that's left. There's been a cataclysmic event that's destroyed most of their worlds and most of their people, and now they're living in these craft worlds, just drifting through space.
Hmm. I think the first thing that stood out to me is, and there's no shade on any later books. It's just that how easy it is to read a Rick Priestley set of writing.
Yeah,
So I love lore, but the way some lore is presented, and we were talking about this before we recorded about another publication. Sometimes it can just be a little bit too abstract, big picture, and it feels quite dry. And I find myself drifting away and not taking in what's on the page. Whereas if I read a really good novel and the characters are strong, I can learn a lot more about the world through their eyes. So sometimes, as much as I want to know about the lore, I find it better to learn about lore through stories. So those kind of big background history can be a bit, I don't know, just too dry for me sometimes. So I do read it, but I have to force myself to. None of that here.
yeah,
It's just really simple. The language is try not to be overly flowery. It's very much written like a history more rather than slightly novelized history.
yeah,
They're not trying to. There's no kind of. This is going to sound bad as well, but it doesn't feel like auditioning to be a future writer
sure.
in Black Library. It's just writing the history of this faction, this race, as I would have said back then for the game, and because of that, it goes in my brain a little bit easier than some other things from later books. So yeah, the whole style of it is just really straightforward
Mm.
and really easy to read. And you're like, oh yeah, oh I forgot that, or I didn't even know that part, and it's just really, really good and straightforward. So I really enjoyed this more than I thought I would actually.
Yeah.
So I'm not super invested in lots of 40k stuff at the moment. I thought I'm going to enjoy reading this from a history point of view, but am I going to actually enjoy the lore? I really did, really did. So yeah, I'll be very excited later in the year when some miniatures come out, and hopefully I've got some time.
Yeah.
Well, it might be the time you're releasing this. Who knows when it is? But you're smart. You might have dropped it at the same time. But it definitely reminded me of why I used to like Eldar back when I had them as a teenager. It's a great presentation of the lore. That's not too wordy.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I find really interesting, actually, because I agree, it's really nicely written. It's very accessible, but it's doing so much world building throughout the course of the book that there's so much like Eldar lore or fluff, as we would have called it at the time, just scattered throughout the book, just constantly throwing stuff out there. But I was really intrigued actually by like the structure, like the literal layout of the lore. So it starts with like your introduction to the Eldar, gets very quickly into Eldar technology, and then you don't actually get the fall of the Eldar until you've sort of learned a bit more about them. And I think what
Yeah.
we would probably see, I might be wrong here, but I suspect we would more likely see it start chronologically. And you'd get the sort of fall of the Eldar up front, and
Yes.
actually just even delaying it just a couple of sections, a few pages, gives you a bit more information about who these people are now to then understand. Okay, I'm invested when I find out that they brought upon their own doom.
100%. Yeah.
It's just an interesting choice, and yeah, it works really well. But the rest of the writing, there's some really really fun stuff in here. I mean, obviously you get quite specific sort of niche detail about how armor works and things like that, like the mesh armor and how it can sort of, it's super flexible because they're sort of loose atoms, and then when it gets hit by something it all locks together and then prevents the
Yes.
damage.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's just cool, and it kind of gives the sense of, okay, these are very sophisticated aliens, they've got some high technology compared to what else we've seen in the 40k universe. And then there's a lot of stuff around the sort of psychic interactions. Like every Eldar is psychic to some degree, and all of their
Hmm.
technology is built out of this kind of psychic material. And they have these psychoactive ships that talk and grow and can respond to the people who live on it. And all of this stuff is really really cool because it is really alien. Like although the Eldar look mostly human, and I tend to think of them as not that different. It's because obviously they're built out of elves, and
Yeah.
elves and men. How different are they really? But when you actually get into the sort of specifics of how they think and function, there is a real effort to make them quite alien, and I think that's dead successful.
Yeah. There's lots of really great ideas and quite. They seem original to me. They may have references to other
As
things
they
that
are, yeah, I
I'm not
bet.
aware of. So whoever's going to put in the comments, no, I think you're fine. For me, it seems pretty original, and yeah, and it's good. It really makes them stand out rather than what would be very simple to just be space elves,
Mm.
and they don't feel like that anymore. Especially as you don't actually see a lot of them without their helmets on either.
Yeah,
You lose what would be that the sort of accidental humanity to them by not seeing in many images at all without their helmets on. In fact, even with the miniatures, there's only one or two. You might be one in a squad of
yeah,
guardians or something, and then the only bits of artwork that I can remember where they haven't got a helmet on would be a harlequin, and then they've got half a mask that's painted in a
sure,
funny
yeah,
way as well. So it'd be very easy to. It almost feels like they go, "Well, no, we're gonna step past this space elves idea." Yes, inherently they are, but really build on their technology being different,
mm.
how advanced they are, but also their weakness as well by their emotions and their psychic connections. So while it's their strength for their technology, it's also their biggest weakness and what caused
Yeah,
their downfall as well. And going back to what you said about the whole fall of the Eldar not being what they led out with, that may well be what hooked me in earlier because again, go back to what I said a few moments ago about that. Sometimes finding it a little bit too dry, a bit too long, as they set up these big prehistories.
Mm.
Always, I find the topic interesting, but I often find it goes on a bit too long. And because they've changed the order of it, I was already invested, and that's the point, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
about trying to imagine what's collapsing and what's falling in this prehistory when you haven't even really been introduced to the players.
What do you think though about the fall of the Eldar? Because, like you say, they are responsible for their own doom. It is their own weakness that has brought it
Mhm.
about. They were decadent and self-indulgent. It really kind of takes that classic, like, again, looking at elves and like Tolkien's elves and all that sort of stuff, and the dangers of this long life, and they,
Yes,
what's going to happen to them. But in 40k, they
yes,
fully just lean into experience. I mean, it's almost a vampire kind of thing as well, where it's like, I've lived for so long that I'm just going to indulge in all the darkest pleasures that the universe
yeah.
has to offer, and then that brings Slanesh into the universe.
I love it. And funnily enough, it got me thinking about how it's thinking about modern world, the modern life, and how there seems to be many versions of way the world could go. And there's the Terminator Salvation kind of version of the world where the AI takes over and humans become slaves. But there's also the other version of where we develop technologies that do all of
Mm,
our work for us, and we can live in bliss, not doing any work. We can just enjoy our lives, which is kind of what's happened with the Eldar here. They got to the
mm,
point where they're so advanced, they're so superior, their technologies are so good that they can spend their time painting miniatures and doing whatever they want. But that's a bad thing, and you need to get out there and do a good hard graft, otherwise to keep your mind pure.
mm,
But yeah, it got my mind drifting when I was reading that and just thinking, yeah, it's bizarrely got some modern day questions about
mm.
society and how society will change when we are finding technology is taking the place of the stuff that we've always relied on us doing as physical graft. And as they talk about the different societies later on, and how they have a more sort of a basic way of living when they're back to tilling the earth
Mm.
and stuff. I don't know. I just thought it was
It's
almost got a
interesting,
modern
yeah.
day resonance of what could be a future problem for us. I don't think it'll be like. I think we're more going to end up more like Terminator probably. But
Well, yeah, potentially. I mean, it's interesting though. Yeah, in a real world, not to get not to get too deep into it, but what happens when all of your needs are fully catered for, and you have infinite resources, and you can do whatever you want with your time? Do you fall into a sort of decadent, selfish
yeah,
whims? I think
how
we
do you
maybe
value
see that
anything?
happening a little bit
You
in,
lose
in the
if
real
everything is
world.
there for you, you lose the value in it,
Right,
don't you?
right.
I mean, I've got young children who takes them a while to understand the value and cost of things. It's so that, well, why can't I just have this?
Mm,
And this toy that's £2 is related to something that costs £200, and
mm.
there's a period where they just can't relate the
Yeah.
difference. And then if that's your lived experience as an adult, be as a human in the real world or as an Eldar in this fictional universe, it's going to mess you up, isn't it?
It
you're
is,
going
yeah.
you're going to do things you shouldn't do with your spare time,
But you really hope
and
that what doesn't happen is what happens to the Eldar, which is that they accidentally birth a chaos god into
yeah,
the warp that then just instantaneously wipes out all of their planets, all of their homelands, and just decimates their population. And it spreads out as well, doesn't it? So
mm,
everyone who's in this sort of the center, the ground zero of it, completely destroyed. All of those Eldar souls lost, swallowed by Slanesh. All of those planets torn asunder or lost to the Eye of Terror as it opens, because the
yeah,
Eldar basically are, it's the original sin of the 40k universe. If it's not Horus and the rebellion and the civil war in the Imperium, it's the Eldar creating the portal to chaos and the realms of chaos. So you get this really interesting, like, the Eldar history is directly related to 40k's greatest sort of narrative arc, I suppose.
yes,
And then
yeah,
you also get this very tragic story, self-inflicted, but essentially all that's left of the Eldar are these craft worlds that are floating around, a few planets out in the far reaches of space who, like you say, didn't like the decadence, didn't like the way things were going, and wanted a simpler life. They wanted to go and work on
Right,
the
dinosaurs.
and ride dinosaurs and be super cool. Yeah. So yeah, you get this really interesting sort of setup. The status quo of the Eldar is that they are a dying race. Their population is falling, and it is a fraction of what it once was. Their great empire is completely destroyed. It literally doesn't exist anymore. It's just these enormous world ships that they float around on, the craft worlds. That's a great setup. Like this is a race of they are just a fighting retreat on an intergalactic universal scale because chaos is coming for them, and there's like a real that's just cool. I think that's such a great like establishing storyline for the Eldar. There's no way out.
That is great, isn't it? And then there's no way out, and then your potential death in the future will be bad as well.
Yes, there's no heaven either.
No, yeah,
It's brutal
because not only have you lost your planets and your civilizations, nearly all of your own gods have been destroyed by Slaanesh as well. And then the only ones that are left are the really angry, violent ones.
The worst ones. Yeah. I mean, that's actually cool. Like you're talking about the sort of, I think we both share a bit of, it's not that we don't enjoy the kind of myths and the legends and the prehistories, but it feels best to me when it is a myth and a legend. And what this book does really nicely is sort of cast all of that prehistory of the Eldar almost alongside the way it's told in modern Eldar society in 40k. So they talk about it as the sort of these epic poems, and you get the Harlequins who tell the stories and act them out as play the different roles of the gods, and you get this myth and this legend of the final battles with Slaanesh and the death of all of the gods, and you do get the great the sundering that takes Asuran it's Asuran, isn't it? Who is shattered into all of the avatars. No,
yes.
Cain. It's Cain.
Cain, yes. Cain, yeah.
He has the final battle. The god of war has the final battle with Slaanesh. Slaanesh can't quite kill him, but he does tear him apart into many, many pieces, and each one of those pieces goes to land in a craft world, and it becomes the avatar that will come back to life when required in battle.
Yeah.
And that's great myth stuff. That's really epic.
And it's presented in a way that, as you said, it doesn't feel like it's taking up too much oxygen before you get to the main part. I suppose you don't have to read. You imagine having to read the Silmarillion before you read the Lord of the Rings every time.
Yeah.
I'm being a little bit.
Yeah.
Since you said, but it doesn't do that, and occasionally in some of the other populations, not all, but occasionally, especially in the main rule book, sometimes it does feel like you've got to plow through a massive, vast prehistory to get to the meat of the setting as it is at the time, and this didn't feel like that. And I don't know if it was put the other way around it to feel like that, whether how much of this is just Rick's writing and it's very clear and easy to understand, or whether it's that nature of the placement of it. But and I didn't even think about the placement of it. I just thought this felt easy to read. But that as well is a really good point.
Do you think, because there's a good amount of time spent on stuff like the exodites. So these are the Eldar who'd left, sort of seen things coming and had left early. Then obviously there are other Eldar who saw things coming, built the craft worlds as well. But the exodites got out far earlier than everyone else, and they kind of live a different type of life, and they work the planets and they work on the lands. They're all rangers essentially, and have their sort of own way of living. There's a lot of coverage of them in the book, and I thought that was very interesting because obviously exodites have always been there. They've always been this kind of cool thing. But there's never a Codex exodites.
No,
and it seems kind of like this book was setting up that there might be, like as an option at some point.
It does give you the feeling, because there's a basic amount of rules there, isn't there?
Yeah.
A couple of profiles. It's not much.
Yeah,
more
and you could build an exodite themed force if you wanted.
If you wanted to, yeah. It feels like that was we're laying some groundwork that this could be a potential way to go in the future. I don't think that ever happened. I've not followed follow
No.
the follow the path of the Eldar through all of the editions at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, it feels like that. I mean, that will be when it'll come back, won't it? That will be a like bringing crew back, or
Yeah.
bringing squats back via Votan or whatever it has to be. That will be a thing at some point in
It
140k
feels like it's
edition.
fertile ground. The exodites have been working the land, and they've got some fertile ground there to grow an amazing army. So it does feel like it's something that could come back. Yeah. The
Yeah, and
the other thing
who knows? We don't.
yeah.
We're recording this in January. Do you? Am I supposed to blow that
No, that's
out of the water?
fine. Yeah, it's
We're recording this in January because we wanted to talk about it.
yeah.
By the time people are watching this, they could be out.
Yeah,
That
there
could be
might be
part of.
that might be an extra army,
We've
that's
had
right.
Eldar teased over Christmas time, didn't we? But before
Yeah.
Christmas, at the reveal
On
was
the
it
roadmap.
roadmap. Was it?
Yeah.
No, it was. There was the weekend when they showed the videos and stuff off. It might have even beginning of
Right.
December or something. But anyway, we could be old news now. It could all be
Sure,
revealed.
yeah.
But it definitely feels like that could be a way of launching them, like they did with the Croup pack, and then you got your
Yeah, very
your
true.
full Tau thing.
Yeah,
I
I hadn't
wonder if
even
they
thought
could
about it. Yeah, we
they
might
could
be on
do
the
it that way.
precipice. It might be about to happen. Yeah. There was
It'd be cool.
it would be really cool. I mean, I think as we sort of say, like Eldar riding cold ones or dragons or reptiles, it's just a cool setup. It's a cool idea. It is a version of Eldar that hasn't been seen officially. They exist here, even here. 1994 second edition 40k. They're in the game, and you could make a themed army around them. But then they
Yeah.
didn't. They were never supported as like an official branch in the way that Harlequins were. And
Yeah, true. I wonder if they would change it a bit the way they like to sometimes and actually put them as part of Drukari, being more of an
perhaps, yeah,
outcast
yeah, you
style
could do.
because it's not Craftwell because it's separate.
Yeah.
Whether they kind of suggest that they're not as evil but still separate from Craftwell and
Yeah.
do it that way
It's
because
interesting actually because the
obviously
Dark
Drukari aren't
Eldar,
in this. This is
they're not.
pre Dark
Yeah.
Eldar.
The closest you
So
get are those outcasts, and within that, the sort of outcast section, you get pirates, and the Eldar pirates do date back to Rogue Trader. I think they're definitely a
yeah,
part of that. You do get the mention of chaos, and that there are
yes.
some Eldar who have fallen to chaos. So it's
That's
not
probably
quite.
the route they were going down.
Yeah, I think so.
For
Right,
this.
and obviously it goes. They just go in a slightly different, more Slaanesh specific direction
Yeah.
when they do get around to doing them. But yeah, it's interesting. There's actually some story sections in here as well, right? There's all of these different, and I think although these are not necessarily the most exciting sort of story excerpts that we've seen across codexes and armies books, there's a nice sort of framing device here, which is all of the different stories take place on the same planet where
Yeah.
Eldar have intervened in a chaos uprising on an imperial planet, and then each different story is from the perspective of a different part of the Eldar force. So you get, your jet bike rider, you get your guardian, you get your I think there's a Farseer, for instance, and they're all sort of musing and reflecting on the battle that's to come from their perspective in the Eldar army. And I think that's a really interesting idea. That's a very nice way of approaching it.
Yeah, so again, mention it again. We've just recorded the Empire one, and then they were Gotrek and Felix were used in the same way, so that had a little bit more impact in some ways for a huge Gotrek and Felix fan. So I was trying to separate myself from that when I was reading these because I kind of thought these aren't going to be as exciting for me because it's not my favourite two Warhammer buddies. But they still Bill King, I believe, wrote them all for this as well. So I think he's listed in the.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think he's listed on the stories. Bill King.
Right. Okay.
So Bill King I think he was in the studio at that point, precisely
does
doing
make
this
sense,
kind of
yeah.
stuff, wasn't he?
Yeah. It just makes sense.
And he does what it's designed to do, which is if you're new to Eldar and you've picked up this book and you like the look of the miniatures, you've got a really good solid background lore, and then these just give it to you in a slightly more narrative kind of way, really trying to draw you down onto the battlefield, giving you a feel for the way these units might think and interact with each other, rather than just being stats or that overarching history of them. It makes them a little bit more personal. And they're fine. They're not, like you said, they're not kind of groundbreaking, amazing stories that you wish that was a whole novel. But they're fine, and they're readable, and they do the job, and they're quite quick and easy reads.
Yeah, which, like I say, their job to do is to sort of show how this army might work in a game, in the setting. So you do get that flavor for the different options that are in the army. Okay,
Yeah.
here's what that might, here's how they might actually fight, and all that
Maybe
sort of
wish, having read a lot of arcane journals for Warhammer the Old World recently, maybe wish that there was one of these in each of those.
Right.
Just a one pager, a little sort of vignette story or something would have
It
been
is. I mean,
fun.
it's always been a nice feature, hasn't it? The vignettes, and you could, again, you get some world building in the midst of it, and you get to see like interactions with enemies and how one race might think about another race. I mean, one of the things that I think was probably the coolest in those stories was that you got the sense of what there was a striking scorpion story, and how the main character in that page just sees war and it's all about the battle. It's like he ignores the beauty and the loss of the planet because he's just there for the battle, because that's what
Yeah.
his entire life is, because he's completely subsumed into his role as a warrior. He's sort of strayed off the different paths that Eldar can go on and just become locked in on one of them. And then that's compared to the Farseer, who kind of sees things in terms of, well, what does this battle represent in the whole sort of story of the Eldar, and why we're here. And different again for a Guardian, who's kind of a bit more like, wants to go back to their day job.
They're militia. They're essentially militia, aren't they?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And so that's quite interesting to get that nice different perspective and get a feel for, okay, these are the different parts of an army of the Eldar and how they sort of fight. Speaking of which, I mean, obviously the army list itself, we won't necessarily go into the rules because there's lots of different stuff and it's of a different age. But what were your thoughts on the sort of general army list options? There's quite a lot of stuff in here, I thought.
There is the book is packed, isn't it? It feels like there's a lot of content, and it's a little bit of. I mean, this isn't negative because you always have more, but I think there's also a little bit of needless repetition that you see.
Yeah.
Changed out of in the later books. I can see why they've looked at it. So you'll get in the lore quite a detailed description of each of the unit types. And then you've kind of got that repeated a little bit when you get to the army list section as well, where they're still repeating, describing what a Guardian is again. And it feels like they probably got a bit smarter to that in later books when they made the original lore part a bit more macro and then included those lore bits in. But it seems like there's a lot there. The stuff you're missing from later stuff is the amount of vehicles, I suppose, in some ways. That kind of, but that's just what 40k was at the time. It was a smaller game, much more
Falcon grav tanks, right?
Yeah. This is what I was getting to at the beginning, but as much as I didn't use this codex, it reminded me of the kind of force I had at the end of the Rogue Trader, which was all Guardians, a couple of units of Aspect Warriors, and grav weapons, really, and maybe one or two too many D-cannons. I liked it because it was familiar, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different the Aspect Warriors, which we've not really talked about yet, but this is our idea of essentially the specialist troops that exist for the Eldar. It's tied very much into the lore, into the background, and how in order to avoid a repeat of their Slaneshi problem that happened to them and that they caused, they now Eldar live these super disciplined lives, but they also live super long lives. So they have to sort of follow these different paths, and that might be the path of, I don't know, an artisan or a baker, but it might also be the path of a warrior and a specific type of warrior. And you hone and perfect your skills using this type of weaponry, this type of armor, and then move on to a different school of of combat. And obviously, if some people, some Eldar who just get too obsessed and get too into it, become the exarchs, and they cannot ever leave that particular path because they are
Hmm.
the sort of perfect example of that type of warrior. But everyone else is kind of a specialist, and then we'll move on and do something else. But you get loads of different types of warriors, these different sort of specialist schools. You get your swooping hawks and your howling banshees, your dire avengers, fire dragons. My favorite, which is the I've completely forgotten what they're called. Where the spiders.
Yeah, now you've said it. I'm going to.
It's a web, not web. I want to call it web spiders, but that's not right. There's striking scorpions,
Dark Reapers.
dark reapers,
No.
and have I invented my own?
Was that a later? Is that a later edition? I don't know. I'm looking at the list of them here. Maybe.
You know what? Now we're gonna have to jump into it. Oh dear.
This is going to
Warp
be another.
spiders. Good
Warp
lord.
spiders. Yeah, we
There
go.
is
Yes,
there's a
you
gap.
were right. You were right with spiders.
Yes, there were the warp spiders. That's right. But like and they've got like kind of big hunched over like shoulders and stuff.
Oh,
But yeah,
were they new for this edition? Actually,
I think they might have been. I don't think all of these different types of aspect warriors existed.
trying to think what I had in my force, and I definitely had all the others. I remember all the
Right.
others, but I don't remember the warp spiders, so I can't remember. Dark Reapers definitely were, but warp spiders might have been one of the new things for this, and that's why they
Yeah.
don't stand out quite as much.
I mean, you also had like I mentioned the Howling Banshees. They're very cool as well. Very interesting. Just as a little note, early on in the book, it does mention that there's very few Eldar left. Every single Eldar is trained for combat. So whether that is as a guardian or down the specialist pathways, that includes men and women. And then you will see in later editions, later kits, obviously you see a lot more female Eldar. In this
Yep.
book, the only female Eldar, I think, are the Howling Banshees. So they very specifically go down that route within the army, which I think, is perfectly fine and very of its time. The Howling Banshees are super cool as like close combat specialists, big blade, big sword. Yeah, a very cool unit.
I think they mentioned in the lore quite clearly that it was almost 50-50 male and female
Across everything except
across everything.
Yeah.
But they said the Howling Banshees were female because Banshees are female. I think
Sure,
that was
as
what
a
it said.
mythological.
So I think you're supposed to assume that many of your guardians are female.
Yeah.
And they just don't have boob armor. And that's probably what it is. Whereas the
that's true.
sculpts have changed and evolved over time.
Yeah. I suppose, like you said
so-
as well, there weren't many heads. Or there were not as many heads at the time. It's all
Nearly
helmet.
everything's helmeted. Apart from your old squad leader, and then your Harlequins, there might have been a couple.
Yes.
But I've got a feeling that you just expected to assume whatever they were. And I'm sure that most young boys at that time would just thought they were male anyway, because that's the way your brain worked about that era. But yes, the Howling Banshees were obviously female, but also they were in the lore bod.
Do you have any favourites from the Aspect Warriors?
I really like Dire Avengers, just the miniatures.
Yeah.
And then they're the most vanilla in terms of what they do.
Yeah.
Because I suppose this is the professional army, isn't it? All the Aspect Warriors. We've already mentioned that the Guardians are the militia. So when they have a large campaign or defense or something to take care of, they have to call the regular people up on other paths, and they have to go and fight as Guardians. But these guys they're on a path as a professional soldier. I suppose that's the way to I suppose that's the way to describe them. But probably just the Dire Avengers because they're my favourite miniatures. Reminding myself of all of them now. And other than that, the Swooping Hawks have been my two favourites. I think.
Yeah, I mean they are all
you?
very cool. I think striking scorpions are pretty cool as well. And then they're not like there are the Harlequins as well. They're very cool, very very characterful. Very unique aspect of the Eldar. Really, they're quite odd, and I think that it kind of plays into the alienness of the Eldar that they have this even within their ranks, they have an even weirder, more alien group of guys who are just traveling around. They're poets and artists and actors who are also extremely deadly on the battlefield, and they've got loads of like just very complex internal dynamics and like and systems and politics of like who gets to play which roles and what that
Yes.
means. And like there's it's just quite it's like a fun complication to this
Mhm.
race that just adds something, I think.
Yeah, and it's it's not needed, but it works.
But yeah,
It's
but
going to be
it
because
does
there's
add,
already
yeah.
so much there
Yeah.
that it almost makes it realistic is not the right word, but more believable
Yeah.
because it takes on the unusual nature that real societies do.
Yes.
You've got nuance there that you think, well, you wouldn't make that up if it wasn't real, and it's almost, yeah, it has been made up, and it's done. It's just, yeah, I
Yeah,
don't know
because it's
how
so specific.
whether it's deliberate, but whatever they've come up with over the number of years developing
Mm.
Eldar. It's a very good story, and it makes a lot of sense from a historical point of view for the game. Whereas some things are a little bit more probably were fleshed out better in later times. At least
Yeah.
feel a little bit more of a complete story. Whereas I think the Imperium of Man now is a lot stronger because of the more recent Heresy series. I think that's added some real kind of historical depth to that,
Right.
and it made it again more potentially pseudo realistic, pseudo
Mm.
historical. Whereas this felt like they were in just a good place right from this early on in the development.
Yeah, totally agree. One thing that I haven't mentioned actually that I really really love is the whole thing with the spirit stones. So this is the idea that, as you mentioned before, when you die, when an Eldar dies, their soul will get stolen by Slanesh because it will just be consumed in the warp. So everyone wears these spirit stones that sort of captures their soul in the moment of death, and then that stone can be placed into the core of the ship, the Infinity Circuit, and then that will allow the soul to sort of live on in this pool of souls. But what's super cool is that you can then take the crystal back, the spirit
Yeah,
stone, and then put it into a dreadnought
Dreadnought.
or put
Yeah,
it into a wraith guard, and then it brings the spirit back into that armor, into that robot to then control it in battle. And it's just
yeah.
this extra like, yeah. I mean, again, it's kind of it is sort of super bleak when you think about it, but it's also very cool. It's this
Well,
proper high fantasy nonsense, but brought into this really cool technological world. I really love it.
Well, it's multifaceted and multi-layered there, isn't it?
Mm,
So you've got the concept of we need to essentially save your soul from
yeah,
damnation,
yeah,
and that's why you have them. But hang on, we can do more with this. We'll also say that afterwards, rather than that just goes to rest somewhere, you actually help power the Infinity Circuit, power our ships, power the core of our society. And oh, wouldn't it be cool if we had a game version for it? Well, we got these dreadnoughts. They have dreadnoughts for Space Marines as well. We could say that this is how they power the dreadnoughts as well. And then the last thing, I suppose, is the visual aspect of it, because
yeah.
spirit stones are this
Like iconic.
hugely visible, iconic thing
Yeah,
that's to do with Eldar, and you see it. The whole idea of a spirit stone and the way that stone is painted in other factions, in elves in fantasy as well. The way that spirits are, that the spirit stone idea is painted as well. It's really grown into something quite unique,
mm,
rather than just being a little bit of an idea of, well, it catches your soul.
yeah.
Just so much more than that.
It is. You're right. Yeah, it's really really cool, and I think so. Looking back into sort of the Rogue Trader era stuff and how this stuff was developing into this book as well, is the Infinity Circuits did exist already. They were what powered the essentially you could use them for ghost dreadnoughts for the Eldar, but there
Yeah.
were also piloted dreadnoughts as well for the Eldar.
Yes.
So they've just kind of expanded out and gone, okay, well, let's take the Infinity Circuit idea and make it a bigger part of the craft world. Let's bring these spirit stones in. Let's make dreadnoughts just this. They solely operate by ghosts, and that's a big part of that thing. And then yeah, Wraithguard. I always loved the Wraithguard miniatures as well. The big, chunky, they look like a dreadnought, sort of scaled down a little bit.
Yeah.
Obviously, they were. I remember how expensive they were, and I think you only got two in a blister, maybe, and it might have been
Yeah.
like £8 at the time or something. I just remember it because I always loved the idea of doing. Is it Iandan who is the craft world that's lost most of its population, so it's most
I
likely
think
to have
so.
a lot of
Yeah, I think so.
Wraithguard. I love that idea of just doing like a Wraith army, this essentially undead army for 40k, in the sort of
Yeah. But it
pre-Necron
definitely
time.
became a thing in later editions, didn't
Right,
it?
and that how cool is that? It's just this really awesome just
Mhm.
idea. It works so well. And because it's undead, but from a very different perspective to the sort of evil of Nagash and the
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's
even the evil or the complex morals of the Necrons is different again from that because these guys are actually fighting to defend something and defend the
yes.
craft world. So there's kind of a sort of noble aspect to it that I quite like.
Yeah, yeah, it's unique as well because the others are more stereotypical
Mm.
kind of sci-fi raising you from the dead, sci-fi skeleton kind of thing. Whereas this is again, like we were just saying, it's a really unique idea that literally powers stuff in the game, but
Yeah,
also powers so many different angles of IP
yeah.
for Games Workshop as well.
I was just thinking, how cool would it be to go back the other way and take the Spirit Stones into Warhammer and
Mm.
have that kind of almost golem, spirit powered golems defending Ulthuan for the High Elves. And then it occurred to me that that sort of is happening in Age of Sigmar. I mean, there's at least one ghost knight. I think I can't remember if
Is
it's
there?
Teclis or Tyrion. The sort of the modern version. Oh
Yes.
no, it's Eltharion. It's Eltharion the High Elf. He is now just a suit of armor, like
Right.
possessed by the ghost. So they kind of have done that. They've sort of taken it. It's gone full circle
Take
all the
full
way.
circle and then
I mean,
out the window and the other way.
yeah, we've not talked actually that much about. We've alluded to it, but obviously there's a real relationship between high elves and Eldar. They
Mm.
did come from the concept of space elves. Let's put high elves into Rogue Trader, but I think the shared development of high elves and Eldar at the hands of Jez Goodwin has
Yes.
played a big part in the sort of visual identity of both races. There are some similarities, not loads, but there's a sort of clear bit of shared DNA
Hmm.
there. And then you do see that in the lore as well. So like the myth, the big story we're talking about, and all the gods, Cain and Vol, Aisha, the story of the tears of Aisha and how the Eldar were birthed from these tears of this goddess. That exists for the high elves as well, plays out in a very similar way in the lore of both fantasy and 40k. I believe in different editions it goes back and forth about whether Cain is actually Khorne, an aspect of the Chaos
Yeah.
God, and there's all of that with the witch elves and that sort of stuff in fantasy. I personally am a big fan of those kind of interlocking, overlapping, slightly confused, you're never quite sure what's the truth, but the idea that there is a shared kind of mythology and cosmos between the two worlds, I quite like it. I like drawing those parallels and being able to find those connections.
Yeah, me too. And I'd still be very happy now if it become official canon
Mm.
that the old world is just a planet somewhere in the
Yeah.
wider universe at any given point, even if it was at a time point vastly in the future or vastly in the past of this. I think that would be quite fun. And
Yeah.
well, we cover that in the main books club when we talked about some of the
Yeah.
crossover weird stories around that time. So yeah, I love it. I think it's really good, and you can definitely see it from a design aspect, especially with some of the posing and the certain areas of the like the Dire Avenger X-Art model, the long plume helmets and things. There's definitely,
Mm.
you can imagine how easy it would be to morph that into a high elf miniature. There's definitely
Yeah.
elements, and yes, it's elves designed by the same designers and the same company. It's going to do that for a certain extent.
Yeah. Yeah. What were your thoughts as well, Stu, on the special characters then? Because you get quite a few here.
You do, and it seems to be the thing at the time, doesn't it? It
Yes,
seems to
very
be the
much so.
thing. I hadn't engaged with them as much because that just wasn't a thing when I played Eldar. So these are names that I'm familiar with, but more often from later lore, so like
Mm.
Eldrad. turned
Yeah,
up in very recent sort of heresy novels and things
sure.
like that. Um, so yeah, I think they're great. I mean, they're lovely old miniatures that I've been familiar with for years, but I've never played a game with them. I don't have any strong opinions of them in that sense. I'm sure there are people that grew up with this as their first book, or maybe even the next edition. That some of those special characters are really important to them
Hmm.
in their gaming life. But I yeah, I didn't. I was always a make up your own characters kind of
Yeah.
person.
I
Yeah.
don't know.
What
I've
about you?
always I've had a soft spot for special characters. Yeah, I think there is certain something about. So I, it was always a bit of a difficult one to square for me. Of so you again thinking back to the Empire, you've got. I've, as a kid, couldn't afford a big army, so you've got one cannon, you've got one unit of great swords, and you've got I don't know one unit of knights, and Karl Franz. And it's like, why is he with 400 points of guys? Like, what mission is this? So it was always a bit silly in my head because we never, like we never had enough money. Your pocket money didn't stretch, and so you couldn't really buy like 1,000 points or a 2,000 point army. And because I was always moving between armies and collecting a bit of everything, and you'd done, all right, I'm not doing Dark Elves anymore. I'm doing something else instead. You never actually were with an army long enough to get to 1,000 points. So you'd have a special character, and he would just be like, oh, like it just would not make any sense. But I do love like the idea that you've got these famous individuals from the stories. They have got this amazing fluff. They've got this really cool art, and then they often, not always, but often were amazing miniatures as well. So
Yes.
yeah, I've always had a soft spot for special characters, even if I don't necessarily like to see them on the tabletop that much. I do like them. I like having them.
Yeah, I love them in the background and lore.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, it's odd. I just didn't grow up gaming with them, and when I going off on tangents, but when I did come back into gaming for fantasy, the meta at the time was is that you didn't take them without permission. That was the general
Right.
feeling at the time. I think that's all changed again now. People, especially with 40k, I don't play 40k much, but people tend to take them now. That's not seen as so much of a thing. And I've got one in my Null Empire army, which again isn't something I would normally do, but it's because it makes it makes that army interact. But back
Mm.
then they were just generally quite powerful. I think
Yeah.
was often an issue. Maybe not always fun for your opponent unless they had a special character as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Um,
they during this era, during the 90s, I think they did work best as part of an unbalanced scenario. So that
mm,
there was very, we're playing a specific game. It's a part of the history of the world. We're trying to recreate a certain battle or trying to get a certain outcome. Obviously you still want to play the game and whoever wins wins. But I think it was better to take into account the fact that these are very powerful characters and they're not always pointed at exactly the right costs. And, it's very difficult to balance some of that stuff. But yeah, I
yeah,
mean, in terms of the actual characters in this book, I mean, Morgan Ra, the Dark Reaper, is great. Like, he's just
yeah.
really, really cool. Um, and I'm also, so Karanras, the Striking Scorpion, I think is very cool as
I'm
well.
sure that's the name of a mountain in Lord of the Rings, but
I
yeah,
would not surprise me whatsoever. But I mean, Jane Zar as well is very cool. The Howling Banshee. So there's like at least three, at least three that I think is cool. But my favorite of the special characters from the Eldar has always been Eldrad Ulthwin. So
uh-huh.
Ulthran, sorry, but that's
Yes,
because I love, and you get some of it in his background in this section here. The way in which they sort of talk about the Farseers, Eldrad in particular, just manipulating the universe to the ends of the Eldar and protecting the Eldar. And this just conceptually is something I think is very interesting and it makes for great stories. So they talk about how actually, in order to protect an Eldar craft world, they will intervene in the sort of internal politics and events of like orc tribes, and essentially, and it doesn't say how exactly, but basically help certain orc tribes to win against other orc tribes and help a certain warlord to take power, so that the warlord whose future would have seen a war going to the craft world is defeated. And
Hmm.
instead of that happening, Ghazghkull Thraka takes power because
Yeah.
Eldrad has manipulated things in his favor, and obviously he then goes to Armageddon and wipes out billions upon billions of people, and that is a success for
It's
Eldrad.
good.
That's like a job well done because he's manipulated the universe in favor of the Eldar, and there's a noble cause of protecting Eldar lives, and I've always quite liked that idea. It's very, I mean, it's really bad, right? And it's the grimness and it's the darkness of 40k, and the reason Eldar are bad guys too. But it
Yeah.
is that one Eldar life is worth a billion other lives. They will
Yeah.
sacrifice anything and anyone to protect one Eldar life. And Eldrad does that in a very cool sort of chess game way. And obviously,
Yeah.
he's featured in some really great stories, the original Eye of Terror campaign, and all the sort of cool stuff he did
Well,
there.
if you like what you've just described, you really do need to read that Horus Heresy series.
Okay, so he's doing it. He's getting involved. Brilliant.
He's
Yeah,
he's getting involved. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I mean, he's
Some of
great.
the
He's a
big
fantastic
underlying
character.
stuff,
Right.
big underlying sort of big picture politically stuff, and all the sly stuff going on underneath, rather
Right.
than just the
One Eldar
Legion
life
smashes
is
Legion stuff. It's
okay.
a big part of that story as well.
It's great, yeah, and it's just a very appealing. I love characters who kind of play that chess game and play it well in the story, and are made to be clever and smart, and their moves they don't always work out, but they know what they're doing, and they're playing that chess game. And yeah, Eldrad represents that in the 40k universe. I think that's cool, and I know you get that elsewhere. You get it with some of the Necron guys and some of that other stuff,
Yeah,
but Eldrad's the
I,
OG.
amazing. Yeah, character wise, I 100% agree with you. My favourite, and I do love all of the Warlock and Farseer models.
Yes,
And had so many of the ones that are in this book in my collection before.
yeah,
And it was what, yeah, I can remember being very proud of a paint job on one of them. I can barely remember it now, and I definitely don't still own it. Looking back, I remember the Arsumen, Arsumen, that sounded bad, didn't it? Arsumen miniature as well.
yeah,
Beautiful, beautiful miniature. And this is back in the days where you've got the banner that you could colour photocopy and cut out of the book
yeah.
as well. You can see, a really, really beautiful miniature. But yeah, the lore wise, Eldrad definitely.
Yeah, yeah, he's great. I mean, I suppose we should take a moment just to dwell on the heavy metal section actually, because it is again chock full of stuff. There's so much cool stuff in here. Yeah, they've got the banners. You can print out the banners and do all that. It's got all the color schemes. There's I don't think there's every single miniature available, but there's a real selection here
Mm.
of miniatures and some really nice sort of inset detail. You get to see certain weapons, you get to see certain like armor details and how things have been painted. It does a great job showcasing like the beauty of an Eldar army, I think.
Yes, I agree. And it's again, it's White Dwarf pages essentially, isn't it? Which was
Yes.
very much of the era of reusing content.
Yeah.
Not that
Yeah.
they've ever called it content back then, but you reusing content. And all three seem to be the kind of the main way of presenting Guardians here. And again,
Yeah.
I can't remember at the time, but before that, I'm pretty sure the Studio Army was all a LATOC, wasn't it? So
It
I
definitely was,
wonder
yeah, because
again,
Andy
whereas
Chambers.
this is
Yeah.
a new change for this edition, and well, that matches Eldrad as well because he's Elfway, I think. So I
Yeah.
wonder if that was a bit of a kind of like this is the new Studio Army for a new era for the reset, almost, isn't it?
Yeah, could well be. Could well be. Because they've done, yeah, really nice work across the board. Of course, you get the vehicle cards as well, classic second
Yeah,
edition stuff,
again, that's
and the
great,
war
isn't it?
gear
I forgot
cards.
about that. It's just
Yeah, I mean
really
that
cool.
was that is a different era of 40k with vehicles. But yeah, it's. I mean, what are your thoughts overall at revisiting the book and sort of revisiting this era of 40k?
It reminds me how much you'd get in a book back then. It feels like so much more. I'll bet you the word count's a lot higher than
Mm,
even if the page count isn't compared to more modern books. I bet the word counts an awful lot. Some of it, like I said already, I think they've probably reproduced stuff in the army section of the book that was already mentioned before, just kind of almost rewritten some of the same descriptions. But it's just loads of detail on stuff that you wouldn't normally have. I'm scrolling through here now, and you've got half a page just on how the Harlequin's kiss worked,
Right.
and and as a teenager at the time, that was you get excited about how gruesome the whole
Sure.
concept of that weapon was, and yeah, it's just loads of detail now that there probably wouldn't be for a single weapon. There
Mm.
would be your stats, and there would be a really, really short, almost a tweet level amount of text worth of flavor text for a weapon these days. Whereas this is full lore around what this weapon does and describes how it mutilates your insides. And it's just lots more of that.
Yeah.
And then a lot more little story bits. Little boxes with little bits throughout. So yeah, it feels like it's absolutely packed full of content in a different way, in a different style. Lots of the word count's got to be higher. It'd be really
Yeah.
interesting. I'm not going to do it, but it'd be really interesting to see how different they are compared to now. And it's just like we said for the Empire book, it just feels really complete.
Mm.
You've got a lot of lore in there that's very easy to digest. You've got a full army list. There are lots of detail around each unit. There are loads of colour plates and pictures from every metal, as well as all the black and white artwork. So it's like a lot more stuff. More artwork. There's a lot of artwork now that would take up a
Loads.
full page. It's
Yeah.
just shrunk down to quarter size just to fill in around things. It's just absolutely packed.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And I think it's easy to take for granted now, like how all these armies work and all of the world building that's done here, because this is lore and fluff and background that's been reprinted in White Dwarfs. Some of it existed before this book, but this is basically setting down the groundwork, the foundations for loads of subsequent codexes, loads of subsequent articles, loads of subsequent stuff. So there's not as much like received wisdom. If you're going to talk about an Eldar jet bike, you need to explain to some degree how an Eldar jet bike works compared to an Imperium one. You need to talk about the Harlequin Kiss. You need to talk about how a Dreadnought works and the Infinity Circuits and all this sort of different stuff because it doesn't exist anywhere else. So this is where a new player coming to the Eldar, this essentially in second edition, this army is a new type of army with its new background that moves things forward from what happened in Rogue Trader to this new version of 40K's world. This is where you've got to do all of that world building from, the basics. And it does that, and it does it really well. It does it in a really interesting way, an accessible way, an enjoyable way. And that is helped by having so much art. Like you say, there is loads of stuff. More or less every single option in the army list has an image, whether it's a Blanche one or a Gibbons one. Many have got multiple. Many have just got this kind of this art that gives you a feeling for this type of the Eldar or for this aspect of their world and their background. And it's incredible because of that. I mean, it's a shame in one sense because so much, like you say, they've made amazing John Blanche pieces. They've cropped them down into tiny little boxes. They're really impactful still, but I bet there's a load of stuff on the cutting room floor that would be amazing to see in all its glory as well. Yeah. But yeah, overall, I think this is a fantastic read. I've always enjoyed the Eldar, and this is a great Eldar codex. It's a great codex. It's just a really good book about the Eldar.
Yeah, it's an all-in-one introduction, isn't it?
It is.
Aside from some of the slight changes, you obviously got nothing in there on Dark Elves, really, and that was added later on. But in terms of giving you a real core basis of the Eldar as a race, this is great. A really easy way to get into it if you'd never read anything about it before. I always say, if Jacob wanted to know about Eldar, give him this rather than the latest codex, because I think this is probably easier to read.
Yeah, I think it will be, and I think you'd get more from it. And then you can go and read the later ones, and some stuff has changed, but there's a lot of strong bones here.
Yeah.
that remain the same. You know, things have been tweaked and changed, details have been added in timelines and to characters and all that sort of stuff. But most of it's pretty similar to how it was
Mhm.
laid out here. Like they did again, they got it right first time with this, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
Really good book.
So we're going to recommend this one. We're saying go out, rush out, and buy 1994's
Rush out.
Codex Eldar if you can find it anywhere, because it's hard to get these days. But yeah,
I
very
haven't
good.
checked eBay for it.
I think it's quite pricey. I mean, not mega, but
Hmm.
these days it doesn't. I'm sure it goes for 40 or 50 quid, something like that.
Oh wow. Okay. See, because the
Yeah,
Empire version that we've just similar era, which is a year later, very similar in many ways for what it does for the
yeah,
respective sort of
yeah,
faction and the game. They're about £30.
yeah.
So
Maybe there's just fewer of these. Maybe the people who bought the Eldar books are still committed to the path of the Eldar. So,
maybe that's what it is.
but
It's
yeah,
also got trendy to play second edition 40k, I
yeah. I
think, at the
suppose that's the
moment, so that
thing,
might have
isn't it?
something to do with it.
Yeah, there's just not as much movement in the copies because people are not pursuing it. But I think overall, yeah, really, really fun to go back and read and well worth it. We're going to be doing more of these non-fiction reviews and overviews and chats about other army books, potentially other codex books down the line. Until we get to those, we're going to also obviously be continuing our GW book club about the fiction. We've got a few more of the original GW books to go, and we're going to be moving into some exciting Black Library fiction as well, aren't we, Stu? So we've got
We
some big
are, yeah.
plans for some stuff that's not necessarily that recent, but more recent than the original 40k and Warhammer Fantasy Fiction. So we're going to
Yes,
be.
more ideas than there is time.
I think that's true. Yeah, that's very, very true. Takes me too long to read a book. Is the thing. I'm too slow.
These are a little
Um,
bit easier, a little bit quicker
yeah,
to
that's
do
right.
than the novels.
But until then, Stu, where can people find you online?
Miniature Realms, head to YouTube first because you're already there. Um, and that's primarily what I do, but obviously you can find me on all the social networks as well.
Good stuff. Yeah, and there'll be links to all of that down in the description below. You'll find links to all of my stuff as well. You can check out my main channel, Jordan Sorcery, and other videos here on Jordan Sorcery Pods. Until then, thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Ace.